Get in there, Lewis. What a way to do it, mate. What a way to win your 7th world title. Mate, you have got to be proud of that. What an awesome drive.
As Lewis Hamilton took his 7th world title, he became, statistically speaking, the greatest driver of all time. And while he is still yet to beat Schumacher's 7 titles, Lewis now has the most wins and the most poles, meaning solely from a statistical point, no one is a better driver than Sir Lewis Hamilton.
Lewis, congratulations for the 7th title. I couldn't have done it better.
But this isn't the whole story, though. Because even when Hamilton won, people on Reddit, YouTube, and various other articles were specifically calling Hamilton the most successful driver of all time, not the greatest, which comparatively is quite odd. Looking at other sports, most of the time, especially of athletes of this caliber, with the best statistics, they are usually seen as the greatest. The best example is probably in ice hockey, where Wayne Gretzky is often seen as the greatest ever play due to his many records. But it's not even that the number one stats equals the greatest ever as in other sports, but it does account for so much more than it does in Formula 1. The greatest drivers in Formula 1 are often not the ones with the most titles, but the ones with the greatest performances. And while there are of course the hardcore fans of people like Schumacher or Hamilton, I don't think anyone would fault you for having this mindset. So to try to explain this point, I want to begin with one of the classics, Juan Manuel Fangio. Fangio raced in the 1950s, and now I think you could argue Fangio is kind of a bad example because, well, he won 5 world championships, so it kind of goes against what I said prior. But I do think it is important to mention him because we can get into what it means to have incredible performances. Saying Fangio is the greatest driver of all time is not something that many people will argue against. He is an incredible driver not just because of his stats. While he is 3rd in the world champions, but he is well under in terms of wins. But of course, this is simply a product of the time. Regardless, he does have something that to this day no one does. When he won those 5 championships, he did it with 4 different teams, meaning he won 1 with Alfa, 1 with Ferrari, 1 with Maserati, and 2 with Mercedes. In terms of just crazy feats, it doesn't really get any better than that. Literally every other driver has at most 2 different teams with winning championships, and the only single exception is actually Nelson Piquet with 3 championships in 3 different teams. And to say that doing that with Fangio today is difficult is quite an understatement. Vettel won all 4 with Red Bull, Hamilton has won 6 with Mercedes, and Schumacher won 5 with Ferrari. All this means that it wasn't the car carrying Fangio to all of these wins. It was him and his skill. The next driver is a personal favorite of mine and is a great example of what this video is about. Jim Clark raced during the 1960s among some of the greatest drivers that ever lived, and only, and I do say only very lightly, won 2 world championships. Compared to so many drivers, Jim Clark is way under in terms of stats, but yet again, many people would consider him the greatest to ever live. Jim Clark did some things that almost gave him a mythical status in Formula 1. While unlike Fangio, he spent his whole career at Lotus, but his performances while there gave him that status. In 1963 at Spa, as his gearbox began to drop out of gears unexpectedly, he had to hold the gear lever in place with one hand and place the other hand on the wheel and drive the rest of the race. In 1965 at Silverstone, his oil pressure began to drop, so in order to remedy this, he began to turn off his engine and coast in the corners, only to turn it back on again during the straights. In both of these races, he won. And finally, his most famous drive likely came at Monza in 1967. Clark started on pole, and as the race started, he quickly led away, but needed to pit with a puncture very quickly. When he finally rejoined the race, he was a lap down from the leader and at the back of the grid. From here, he began to storm back through the pack, lowering his lap times more and more all the way down until he finally reached the lead. Yet, unfortunately, the car had simply not been fueled for this type of engagement and spluttered near the end of the Grand Prix. Jim Clark finished 3rd of that race, but to this day, some call him and that Grand Prix itself the greatest of all time. Out of all the sounds that I've played throughout this video, this one is likely the one that most of you will recognize. This is basically the big one and kind of the reason I made this video. Ayrton Senna is often seen as the greatest ever by most people, meaning that out of all the fans of Formula 1, Senna right now is likely the driver most cited as the greatest ever. He has again quote unquote only 3 world champions and 41 wins. Now, interestingly, Senna does have one stat that does contribute to the reason he is so famous. His pole position record of 65 was held for 12 years, but really, again, even within the stats, the performances are the real key. Some of his performances in the final round of qualifying go beyond what had ever been done and what has been done since. His most famous moment, or perhaps the most famous moment in qualifying, was at Monaco in 1988. Senna says of that moment, "I was no longer driving the car consciously. I was driving by instinct, and only I was in a different dimension. I was way over the limit but still able to find even more, and it frightened me because I realized I was well beyond my conscious understanding." The relationship between Senna and his car would put him on pole that weekend by 1.4 seconds. Compared to today, in 2019, the pole margin was just a tenth of a second, and we can see why this is such a feat. This, among others, Senna's performances alone are some of the greatest of all time, and it gets to the root of why trying to find the greatest ever in Formula 1 is so difficult. Not only do we have the various eras to deal with vastly different machinery, but the added variable of the car itself. We have to separate the driver from the car to truly find the best, but I think the best way to explain this is with an analogy. If you put me in a Porsche 919 Evo and Sir Lewis Hamilton in a 97 Toyota Camry, I could probably beat him going around Silverstone. But does that make me a better driver? And that right there is the point. In Formula 1, we almost have to separate two entities that are flying around a track at 200 miles an hour in perfect harmony. So when it wouldn't really matter that I beat Hamilton, the way he drove is what really matters.